An interesting request from commenter Bagmonster on a recent video was to do a forecast on the potential sales of Donkey Kong Bananza. I thought this was an interesting exercise worth exploring, so in this video we're going to look at the potential of this game, both in the immediate term and, what I guess most of us are really interested in, how it's likely to perform over the life of the Switch 2. The difficulty here is, of course, that there's not really a direct precedent for this game. Huge 3D platformers from Nintendo's first-party developers are usually of a Mario variety, while Donkey Kong's previous outings have been quite different in many respects as well. All that said, the idea that DK's sales potential is significantly less than Mario's is a relatively recent idea. The original Donkey Kong Country on the Super NES is the third best-selling game on the system, with 9.3 million reportedly sold. That sits well under Super Mario World's 20.6 million, but Donkey Kong Country arrived 4 years after, and in the last couple of years of that system's life, and of course was superseded very quickly by 2 sequels, whereas Super Mario World had a whole system lifespan to sell. Notably, Country significantly outsold Super Mario World 2, which released only 8 months later. Donkey Kong 64 was N64's 7th best-selling title, only a few hundred units shy of Smash Bros. Total, and even Donkey Kong Country Returns' 6.53 million units on Wii was pretty respectable when you consider that Super Mario Galaxy 2, which had released only a few months earlier, only ended up with 7.41 million on the system. Of course, there have also been games that have been far more mediocre sellers, with Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze held back by the system it launched on, and Jungle Beat perhaps struggling with a relatively poor reception and the eccentric Bongos control system. The 2018 release of Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze might have seen a revival. After all, Mario Kart 8 didn't suffer from being ported, and Tropical Freeze is truly an incredible title. However, the last reported figures suggest that it picked up around 4.62 million purchases on Switch, often quoted as north of 6 million by folding it in with the Wii U numbers. No slouch by any means, especially for a very bare-bones port, but given how astronomically successful some Switch franchises have managed to become, it must have been seen by Nintendo as a relative disappointment. It's pretty clear from Returns and Tropical Freeze, therefore, that a 6 million lifetime sales target could be the kind of central expectation for a high-end 2D Donkey Kong game. But of course, this is not a 2D title, and it is clearly something far more ambitious than even the previous retro games. This is a highly prestigious, apparently very expansive title, positioned as the second major first-party title for a new system, and the first to be primarily a single-player experience. It has the potential, if Nintendo position it well, to sell and sell throughout the system's lifespan, which could be for a very long time. So, let's take a look at what kind of sales numbers we could expect to see. Early on, of course, the game will have its potential capped by the install base of Switch 2. We know that north of 3 million consoles were sold out of the gate, and if by the time the game comes out there are around 5 million Switch 2s in the wild, that's obviously going to be the upper tramline of potential opening sales. When Breath of the Wild launched, there was a brief window where the attach rate of the game was actually higher than 100% of the console sold, presumably indicating that people found it easier to get their hands on the game than the console, but this was a unique situation and specific to that game. Donkey Kong is more niche in many respects as a high-end game. Breath of the Wild feels like it sinks more comfortably into the middle of the Venn diagram of what Nintendo hardware fans want to see, and also what early adopters of technology more generally might be interested in. Still, one can assume that most early adopters of Switch 2 are going to be fairly compelled by Nintendo's output, and given the emphasis that they're putting on this one, I think a decent attach rate can be guaranteed. Let's go over to a few different games for comparison, starting with Splatoon 2, a major title for Nintendo which went on to have 8-figure sales. This has somewhere north of 600,000 Japanese sales in the first few days, and estimates suggest that this would mean over 1 million sold internationally on a system that probably had a similar install base after 4.5 months to what the Switch 2 might have after 6 weeks, due to the much higher initial demand and smoother fulfillment of Switch 2 compared to its predecessor. Nintendo own estimates from their September 2017 investor presentation states that Super Mario Odyssey had 2 million copies sold within 3 days on a console with 7 million units sold. More recently, Tears of the Kingdom shot to nearly 20 million sales on a console that at the time had just over 100 million as an install base. It seems pretty consistent that around 20% of the audience of these consoles are likely to want to jump into these absolutely top-tier behemoth titles on day one. And while DK may not be ultimately quite so massive as these other games in the context of the Switch 2, it certainly has a very major position in the marketplace. Therefore, I would say that there is a 90% chance that we will see over 1 million sold by the end of the first weekend, and a 50% chance that we will see over 2 million sold if the core audience truly are all in on a new showcase title for the system. After that, I think it becomes a little trickier for the Great Ape and the Superstar Singer. The first holiday season will be crowded with iconic titles, and while Donkey Kong Bonanza will be an important component of this launch lineup, it's unlikely to receive quite the same focus that titles like Super Mario Bros. Wonder and Mario Kart 8 Deluxe have had in recent years. Nor is it likely to be the same kind of evergreen seller with the ultra-casual crowd that Switch Sports was, for example. Also, while Splatoon 2 had regular updates, keeping it in the limelight, this risks being a title that is forgotten about relatively quickly until or unless Nintendo add to it or promote it in other ways. If September brings news of a new Mario 3D epic, then Bonanza may soon feel eclipsed. I'm reminded a little of Pokemon Legends Arceus, an incredible title that was scooped less than a month later after its launch by the reveal of an open-world, new generation Pokemon game. Did this put a ceiling on Arceus' potential? It's hard to say for sure, and of course the game still sold highly respectably, especially since, unlike the generational Pokemon titles, it had just a single version available. But I feel like giving it a year or so to do a victory lap must have had at least a small chance of being able to drive its sales up further, and I think it's a bit of a pity that it didn't happen. For Nintendo, though, they don't need to worry too much about all this. They will get a big bang at first from people who just want a major new game to play on a system that as yet doesn't have a major first-party library that's exclusive. Then, around the time of the film, they will be able to cross-promote DK to at least some extent, depending on how prominent he is in the Super Mario World movie. However, you just know that sometime this generation there will be a Donkey Kong film, even if it's in many years' time, and even if Nintendo expand the lineup of Donkey Kong games massively by then, to the point that Bonanza is kind of old hat, there's still no world where a massive title like this one won't be a key element of their sales strategy. I also think that the $70 price tag is an indication of their long-term strategy as well. It's not apparent to me at this point that in terms of effort and scope that there's a significant difference between Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza. Now, it's probably true that the size of the open world for Mario Kart World makes it a bigger and more complex game from Nintendo's internal perspective, and it's certainly a bigger game in terms of sales potential and audience awareness footprint. But Nintendo isn't shy about pricing top-tier games with top-tier pricing, and when they've opted not to, it's often for a good reason. Recall Metroid Prime Remastered being actually far cheaper than almost any game that year, despite being such a huge effort proposition. I suspect that Nintendo want a price that will tempt people into the Donkey Kong universe, and especially families and young children. If and when more games start hitting the $80 mark, which I suspect may be a little while yet, Donkey Kong Bonanza will still appear slightly more affordable, and this in itself may expand the Donkey Kong audience, although it has to be said, as I've mentioned before, that the effect of pricing on people's willingness to buy games is actually a lot more slight than seems to be commonly supposed. So, thinking long term, where might Donkey Kong Bonanza end up? A good comparison point may be Kirby and the Forgotten Land, which last year was reported to have 7.52 million sales up to the end of March 2024, and will surely have a chance of crossing the 10 million sales boundary by the end of the Switch 2 generation, with the benefit of the DLC and just sheer time on the market. Like Kirby, Donkey Kong is well known, but not quite as universal as Mario and Pikachu. Like Kirby, DK is known for one type of platforming experience primarily, and like Forgotten Land, this game takes him into new territory. Still broadly within the platforming genre, but very, very different in size and scale and scope. Kirby Star Allies, as the first Kirby game on the Nintendo Switch, releasing in March 2018, had sold around 4.83 million by the time of last reporting in 2022, and that was a game that had a rather anemic initial set of review scores. That suggests a max effort remount of a major franchise could be said to have the potential to add, like with Forgotten Land, about 50% to 75% to the baseline sales expectation if all goes well. A more radical example is perhaps Breath of the Wild compared with Skyward Sword, which would suggest a far bigger increase, although it's been pointed out that, expressed as an attach rate, Ocarina of Time was actually similar in stature to Breath of the Wild for much of the N64's run. Either way, I would expect this level of effort to be rewarded at least to some degree. So let's take 6 million as the baseline for Donkey Kong for the duration of a system's life. Add a 2/3 uplift for being a major game, and I think it could be expected to hit 10 million in sales once the Switch 2 install base is significantly large. Let's say by the end of 2028, by which time Nintendo will hope to have an install base of around 80 million. For the sake of accountability, let's go on record now and say that there's a 70% chance, therefore, that Donkey Kong Bonanza will cross 10 million sold by the end of 2028, although because Nintendo only currently reports sales when they cross a million in a year, it may be a little difficult to actually get confirmation on this. Factoring in the likelihood of Nintendo to sweat the asset and try to recoup the considerable effort put into the game, though, I expect it to continue to sell at a trickle for a good while yet. Granted, there are early in system life titles that do sometimes become forgotten quite quickly, ARMS being a sad example. But I think Nintendo has big plans for both DK and Pauline, and so while this may not be the most evergreen title ever, I think it will have some sticking power, and I would be very surprised if it doesn't hit 10 million in its lifetime. What about the lower and upper end possibilities? Well, if initial reviews are more muted and there are problems in the games that aren't initially apparent, then it could well be headed for something closer to the standard 6 million. Forgotten Land wasn't just revolutionary, but it was also absolutely excellent, and Nintendo has earned the right to have faith that they can deliver top quality, so I'm not really worried about that. Now, if DK and Pauline really become huge breakout characters who really spark a light with Japanese schoolchildren and more players, there's a chance that the game could do significantly better. But a lot of the stars have to align for this to happen. The Switch 2 itself needs huge sales. There's probably needs to be some kind of major Donkey Kong movie relatively early and focusing on the same characters as the game, and Nintendo would need to decide to hold off on newer DK content in order to prioritize sales of Bonanza. While some franchises like Splatoon have really caught fire, DK is an older and more established property, so I think that's a trickier proposition, especially since the game is primarily a single-player experience. Super Mario Odyssey is circling in on 30 million copies sold, and it's really difficult to see Donkey Kong Bonanza topping the next Mario, however much of a head start it has. But 15 million or maybe a shade higher does feel plausible given enough time. While this may not blow up DK into another Mario or Zelda just yet, I think this will secure DK's rightful and previously held place as one of their top IPs, and while the Switch years have been fairly fallow for good old DK, with so much effort being put into positioning the IP and building up his games catalogue, I would say there's a 50% chance that we'll have sight of another Donkey Kong title of some description before the end of 2027, even if it's just a smaller affair or a Nintendo Switch 2 edition version of a previous title such as Tropical Freeze. If you'd like to support the channel, please do check out the Patreon, like, subscribe, comment and share, but if not, I'm so grateful you're here, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.